Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Matt CPD event. Today, we are going to be talking about a critical approach to instructional coaching, and I'm really pleased to be joined by Sam Gibbs. Sam is the Trust Lead for Curriculum and Development for the Greater Manchester Education Trust, and she's going to tell us a little bit about herself and her background.
Hi everybody. As Tracy said, I'm Sam Gibbs. I'm currently employed by the Greater Manchester Education Trust, and my role is to lead on the development of the curriculum across our 4 secondary schools. Like Tracy, a big part of my role is also teacher development, making sure that all of our teachers have got access to really high quality evidence-informed professional development. So I'm an English teacher by trade, so I've taught English for just over 15 years. That's sort of one of my main passions and interests. I've recently published a book about English curriculum, and I still do a lot of work in that area. And then my other really big passion and interest is teacher education, and I'm particularly interested in instructional coaching, which is obviously why I'm here today. Prior to this role, I spent 3 years working for Ambition Institute, which is a large teacher training organisation and provider of CPD. And one of the main things that I did there was to work with schools across the country on instructional coaching at a variety of levels. So sometimes it was schools where they'd not done anything like that before, but they were interested in it as a form of teacher development. And then in other cases, it was for large trusts where they wanted to upscale it across a number of schools. So I worked at quite a strategic level with senior leadership teams, helping them to think about how they could implement it, but then I also was quite operational with it. So I went into schools, coached a lot of teachers myself, went into a lot of lessons, led a lot of coaching discussions, and sort of looked at it from that perspective as well. So one of those schools that I worked with on that programme for 2 years is one of the schools that's now in my trust. So I guess I've got a fairly unique perspective in that I've spent 2 years working with that school really closely, helping them to develop instructional coaching and to scale it up. But also having then worked with them and then spent a little bit of time away and then gone back as an employee, I've sort of seen what they've done with it since. And we've, I think, more recently started to explore a bit more broadly sort of different models of coaching, and had to think really, really carefully about how, if and when we want to scale that up across our other schools as well.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk a little bit later about what some of those experiences have taught you, and certainly what we can learn as a trust about how you might implement things at scale and doing it in the best way possible. That's great, thank you. So if you could just tell us from the start then, what do we mean by coaching, and specifically what do we mean by coaching in education?
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to start, because of course coaching isn't a new thing. It's not a new idea. It's been around for decades. Lots of other professions use coaching. The obvious example is sports. Instructional coaching is in education is still quite broad, although I think it's recently come in the UK to mean something quite specific. But actually, say in America, it's been a thing in education for a really long time. So there's people like Jim Knight, who's been working in instructional coaching for nearly 30 years. I think it's really important to know that there's not one model, there's not one way of doing it. There's not even one shared definition of what it is. So Jim Knight's definition, for example, of instructional coaching is working with a teacher in collaboration on their instruction. So instruction is just kind of the American word for teaching. Whereas in the UK, what it's come to mean more recently is instructing a teacher on their teaching, and it's become quite closely tied to the direct instruction sort of pedagogical approach. But I mean, broadly, there's some common ingredients, I think, even in all these different definitions. So essentially, it's a more expert teacher working with a more novice teacher to improve the teacher's performance, which then should hopefully improve their pupils' performance. And some of the common ingredients are the expert sharing a model of good practice, the more novice teacher having the opportunity to see that model, to practice it, to receive some feedback, and the outcome of that being one one or no more than a couple of really clear granular action steps that teacher can take away to work on. Usually the practice is done outside of the classroom context, with the idea that if the novice teacher practices that thing repeatedly, when they then go into the classroom and do it live, they're more likely to be able to do it in a really busy, complex environment such as a classroom. So essentially, there's those core ingredients in common. But in the UK, I think the model of doing it has become really quite specific. So lots of schools are using the 6-step model, the Paul Bambrick-Santoya model, or other iterations of that. So see it, name it, do it, which I think is really heavily linked to the ECF agenda, and the fact that that is a specific style of coaching that is in that programme and that early career teachers are using, and lots of schools are seeing an opportunity, I suppose, to roll that out across the school.
I think one of the things that I've certainly noticed in my conversations with colleagues is that I think instructional coaching has become synonymous with early career frameworks and early career teachers, and therefore if you were going to implement this model later with teachers who've been teaching for a longer period of time, that there are some sort of more sensitive ways to it. We need to judge that. You know, some people might see it as a failure, that they need more support or perhaps more intensive support. Has that been something that's cropped up in your research or your reading or your own experience?
Yeah, it really has. I think that's one of the things we have to be really careful about, is that if we do choose to utilise the benefits of coaching across school, and and it can be, and I've seen it be really powerful with early career teachers, that really granular, targeted focus and regular support that those teachers really benefit from, and that the early stages of their career, we just need to really be mindful of whether that is always the right approach, or whether it's replicable for teachers that are, maybe in a later stage of their career, but are struggling in particular areas. And I think maybe if we make that assumption, it can be quite damaging for those teachers. So that's why I think there's a need to explore the model and the sort of processes that sit behind it, and really take time and care at that stage before just rolling it out. And I think that links to sort of one of the big sort of findings from the evidence around coaching is around this idea of agendas. So I recently wrote my master's degree dissertation on how instructional coaches experience professional learning in secondary schools, and that was the big thing that was like a case study. And what the coaches said to me was, where they found it really difficult was when they were unsure about the agenda. So they were given like a really vague purpose, like, just go off and improve teachers. And they sort of had this underlying worry or concern that what that might lead to was that teacher who was struggling, this being sort of the prerequisite to a support plan. And they suspected that, therefore the teacher might suspect that, therefore what was the agenda that kind of sat behind that. And 3 of those coaches were also working with ECTs at the same time, and were quite confused, or they were questioning whether it was right to use the same approach. And for some of them, they ended up using the same approach. And for others, they said they felt like they were doing 2 completely different types of coaching, or they were trying to, and they weren't sure which one was right. So I think what that probably shows is that not enough thinking has gone on at the planning stage, and there's not been enough clarity for those coaches about the agenda and wider coaching on what they're expected to achieve.
Absolutely. And so I think what I'm getting from the conversation so far is that you've got to scratch beneath the surface of some of these things as well. And that what we know in education, as soon as you open one door and ask that question, it leads to lots of other questions and lots of other sort of issues, so to speak, to try and fix. Okay, that's really helpful. And I think what we've got there is a message to senior leaders and to people who are kind of instigating coaching in their schools, that you've got to be professionally skeptical about this. I know that's a phrase that Ambition use quite often, is that professional skepticism of any model is not just going to fix problems that we've got straight away. And those kind of knee-jerk responses to, well, here's a struggling teacher, this is the solution, is not the way forward necessarily. So talk to us a little bit then, Sam, about how and what kind of benefits coaching can have to an educational organisation.
Yeah, so I think, for teachers, it's a way to experience professional development that is obviously very different to sitting in whole school CPD sessions, where by their nature, at least a part of them is going to be, a part of it is going to be generic, and they're going to have to do the cognitive work to sort of make sense of that within their own subject. Whereas with instructional coaching, you know, it is bespoke, it's one-to-one, and it's focused on the teacher and their development. So there's obviously a number of benefits to that, not least the, you know, the headspace and the time that's put aside for teachers to be reflective, and that you know, to have that sort of dialogue and that discussion that's about them and how they can improve, obviously as long as that's done in the right way. The opportunity to work really closely with another colleague and have that sort of really deep dialogue. I think for the coach, our coaches, I think, really enjoy being able to make a difference within the school and to feel they can have that direct impact. And we try to really, you know, we big them up and we say, you are really the engine of school improvement. And when they started, I'd say probably some of them were a bit more reticent and said, you know, but how are we going to find the time? And, you know, I've got my own classes to teach, and how am I going to prioritize this? And so we talked about how, you know, as a teacher, you can have an impact on, you know, 30 children in a class. So, you know, maybe you're teaching 200 if you're a secondary school teacher. When you're working with a teacher that you're coaching, you're doubling or tripling your impact, because you're then impacting on all those children that they're teaching. So I think they've really enjoyed that, and the status that's given them, and their sort of feelings of credibility and their ability to make a difference to the school. For some of them, they don't want to go down the senior management route. They're not interested in that. They want to work in teacher education. And so it's given them the tools and the time to do that. And then I think for the kids, you know, we've got to be careful not to overstate the impact of instructional coaching, because actually the evidence is quite mixed in terms of success. And it's particularly mixed when it's implemented in schools where there's a high accountability and performance culture, which is whole worms. But for the kids, you know, having a teacher, being taught by a teacher that is continually engaged in dialogue about their own professional development has got to be a positive thing. I think all those things together for all stakeholders within a school, it's really beneficial. We have certainly seen big benefits across our schools.
Can I just pick up on what you just said about those schools that perhaps have got greater accountability kind of measures in place? Where do you think the coaching goes wrong in that sense? So they may well have a framework for how it is implemented across a school. Where are perhaps the caveats or the pitfalls of that approach for those sorts of schools?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's like we were sort of talking about before. It's partly conflating the needs of new teachers with the needs of struggling teachers. But I think the other big thing to be mindful of is how it interacts with accountability systems within school. And obviously that looks different within every school context, but I think it's really important that we've worked really hard to make sure that it's not aligned with performance management and appraisal. It's quite hard doing that in practice, because you probably find when you look at who are the best people to be the coaches in your school, that by nature of it, some of those people are middle leaders, you know,
or your UPS3 teachers.
Yeah, and you just have to be, and I say this, you know, I'm a coach myself, so I've got a teacher, just one at the moment. I had 3 last year that was coaching, and I have to kind of keep myself in check about that, you know, that my role is trust leadership. I do all the trust QA, you know, I do a lot of stuff that is connected to how we measure and evaluate our approach as a trust, and, you know, and impact on outcomes. So if I go into a teacher's classroom and say, I'm here to work with you and it's all about your development and I'm here to support you and this is non-judgmental and all the rest of it, I've got to keep in mind that the teacher might not necessarily believe that. And so I've got to really work to uphold that trust. And all the evidence around coaching aligns, you know, it's a common theme through a lot of the papers, is this idea of trust. And without it, coaching can so easily be derailed, and gains that you do make can be surface and short term. And what makes it sustainable is where that relationship is there and is based on that trust. And that's hard, because it goes back to what I was saying about agendas. You know, if you as a coach have been asked to work with a teacher who's struggling, you've got to be really, really mindful about the feedback loop there. So what happens if 10 weeks down the line, you're coaching that teacher and you're not seeing that improvement? Sorry, my cat's just...
It wouldn't be an online interview without a cat to pee.
Like taking us back to the lockdown days.
Yeah, I'm getting flashbacks.
What was I saying?
Feedback.
So as senior leaders, I suppose the question to ask is, how are you in utilising coaching? What information are you collecting that's true to the ethos of coaching? And thinking about that really carefully, so that coaches aren't put in a situation where they feel that trusting relationship they're building with their teacher is being compromised.
Can we just come back to the kind of the basis of coaching, or instructional coaching at least, being talked about in terms of an expert and a less expert teacher? Because there's some really interesting research about expertise, isn't there, and that experience doesn't necessarily equal the same thing. My question would be, how do you ensure that the teachers are getting the high level diets that you would want them to? In other words, how do we guarantee the expertise of our coaches in schools? Right. Or is that another challenge that we need to be?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. And I think this has been the aspect of coaching that's been the most sidelined. I suppose one question I would have about bought-in models and bought-in platforms and very prescriptive structures and stepped models is, like with any useful scaffold, they're great at the beginning as they structure the thinking and the work of coaches. I certainly, when I was at Ambition, I had a really prescriptive model, and it was really helpful. I'd never done coaching before, so I needed that in place. I needed to know the stages of coaching. Now, as I got better at coaching, increasingly I was more flexible with that model, so the model began praise, probe. I didn't always do the praise first. Sometimes I would do it later, or I would. So I'd made that, and that's part of developing expertise, isn't it? That as you gain more flexible knowledge, you can make this adaptation. So my question would be, if you are buying in coaching models and platforms, at what point are you going to start to slowly remove those from coaches? Because it's offloading the cognitive work, it's outsourcing it. And if you're trying to implement coaching at scale, that can seem like a really attractive way to think about it. So we'll buy in a platform, all our 20 schools will do it, brilliant, we're all doing coaching, that's the way we go. But the key to all of this is the coach, and that's something I've been thinking about a lot recently. And we've been working at one of my schools on coaching now for over 3 years. We're at the point now where we've got probably 6 really good coaches. It has taken us that long to give them enough input and to put the structures in place and create the conditions for it. But we're working on what I'm calling a coaching curriculum with those coaches. So I'm really lucky, the head teacher has given us an hour a week to work with coaches. And I've designed a curriculum for them, employing all the curriculum principles that we know are important, so kind of key concepts, thought about how they're sequenced. They're getting a lot of sort of evidence-based input. We have time for coaching on coaching, for practice, for looking at models of coaching. And I guess our best bet is that if we invest in their training and their professional development, they're the ones then going off, they can work with 2 or 3 teachers each, and then the impact of that we think is going to be big. But when we started coaching 3 years ago, I wasn't even thinking really about that, and how we were training the coaches. And that's what a lot of the research around coaching tells us, is that we sometimes assume too much about the people that we want to coach. We assume that they are ready-made experts. We assume they're ready just to kind of go out and do it, that they've got all the pedagogical knowledge, they've got the knowledge of how to teach that to other adults, and often they don't, and why would they have? So again, I'd say before even thinking about rolling anything out, even across one school, there are some really important questions to ask about who those coaches are going to be, how you're going to train them, and then how you're going to continue to support them.
Yeah, because I suppose there are 2 things at play there. There is the kind of expertise in how you manage the coaching conversation and the coaching relationship and all of those things, but also the actual teaching expertise. Do they know confidently how to do this, or the various models, not just like it's my way or the highway, but here are the other possibilities here. So I suppose there's that necessity for them to be at the forefront of educational thought and educational thinking, as well as being really effective coaches at the same time. That's a tough that's a tall
It
order.
is, and I think our coaches definitely, have said to us they felt that pressure that they were expected to know everything, and be everything to everyone, and we've had to think carefully about that. And I guess the question there is, what are you coaching on? Where the evidence supports instructional coaching, it supports it where the pedagogy and the content is clear. And I think this is, again, another difference with America, that they've got a common model in the USA where people are full-time instructional coaches and they go around schools and that's their job. What we're trying to do in the UK is kind of shoehorn it in often along all the other side, the other things as well. And whereas in the USA, there's a lot of sort of like literacy coaching that goes on. So the role of a coach would be, to implement a really specific literacy program and to support teachers to do that. The pedagogy underpinning that is clear, the outcomes are clear, whereas I think sometimes we're quite vague. What we've worked really hard on last year and carrying on this year is aligning what we want coaches to coach on with the content of our teaching and learning framework. So there's that clarity. And because we're not assuming that coaches come to us with all that pedagogical knowledge, we see CPD as a way to help them to put extra tools in their toolbox as well. And we're using it really as a way for teachers to better implement the CPD, because we know a lot of CPD makes absolutely zero difference to teaching practice unless you follow it up with a further implementation tool. So we are much clearer, I think, now about why we are using instructional coaching, not just because everybody's doing it on Twitter or because some early career teachers are doing it, but because we think it's a really powerful way to support teachers to better implement things in CPD and therefore get more value for us out of all the time we invest in that, rather than what we were doing before, which is probably a bit vague.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think we've touched on quite a few of the kind of overall criticisms. And again, coming back to that point, it can seem like a panacea, can't it? It can seem like something that's going to fix all of the problems that we've got in our schools. And you can understand why some leaders getting to the point of thinking, well, actually, I need something that's consistent over a period of time that's going to fix this issue. And therefore, coaching must be it. We're time poor as a profession, aren't we? People are under pressure, especially in those schools that have got even heavy accountability measures. So I think we've touched there on a few of the criticisms of coaching. Could I perhaps challenge you to 3, maybe the ones we mentioned already, or maybe other ones, 3 kind of criticisms of coaching?
Yeah, I suppose the question is, who would be doing the criticising, really? And I think because I don't think there are any drawbacks to implementing coaching for all those reasons that we talked about earlier. Where it's done badly, there's lots of reasons it could be criticised, and there's all sorts of things there. There's sometimes kind of barriers of perception that you need to overcome. So I think where a teacher would criticise it when they first hear about it, and we've had this, is does this mean that I'm rubbish? And the amount of times I've sat with a teacher to coach them and done an initial sort of meeting about how it's all going to work, and they've gone, oh, thank God, I thought I was doing this because I was rubbish, and you're telling me that either everyone's doing this or this is actually about development. So I think where they would potentially be critical, it's important to think about addressing those potential criticisms head on, sort of when you start working with them. I think we've talked about kind of conflict of agendas and that equating of early career teachers with more struggling teachers. I think a really big criticism that coaches and teachers might have is, this is another fad, it's another gimmick, it's another, we're just doing this for Ofsted, or because it's on Twitter, or because some edgy Twitter celebrity person has said this is a good idea. Oh God, it's another thing. But I think that all comes back to the same root cause, which is where leaders haven't been able to, haven't had time to, haven't made it a priority to do the deep thinking that needs to happen before you start to do anything with this. In my experience, where leaders do that, and this is carefully sort of presented to staff, but and presented is the wrong word actually. What I mean is they're involved in that process, working with the coaches to say, what can we do, what can we achieve? You can waylay a lot of those criticisms where teachers can see it's being done thoughtfully and it's not being done to them, and the conditions have been put into place for it to work. And time is a big one there. That would be a big criticism. Oh, we haven't got the time to do this. The kind of harsh reality is, if you don't create the time, and sometimes that involves having to be quite creative with the way you organise the timetable and things. If you don't do that, it won't work. That's the kind of, the kind of harsh reality with it. We've created an hour a week for coaches and teachers to work together, and an additional hour for coaches. But obviously we've got to offset that. To focus on doing this, we've got to not do something else. And it's always about, like Dylan Williams says, dropping some good things that work to do things that are even better or could potentially be even better. So I think they're the sort of things you need to think about in order to avoid these criticisms.
I think that's that fertile ground moment. I always just think, as a school leader, your kind of responsibility is to prepare the ground for anything that's going to be launched at any one time. And the timing of everything is everything, isn't it? It won't be right if you've just done 4 CPD sessions on Rose and Shine in the hall with everybody else and say, oh, actually, now we're going to instigate this. I think teachers get fatigued with change, don't they? They get really, really tired of that kind of constant change. One of the questions I did have is about longevity of this sort of program. So for your typical teacher in the schools that you're talking about, would they undergo a coaching program for a half term, a term, a full year, and then what happens with those people after that?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. And again, because this is still relatively new in the UK, or the kind of version of it that's popular at the moment is relatively new. I don't think we've got the evidence yet about the sustainability of all of this. I don't think we've even got the evidence of impact at scale. In fact, the evidence we do have shows that when you do try to upscale coaching, the positive effect size lessens. So we've got to be careful around sort of all of these things. But like with anything, I think, that we implement in schools, it comes back to that initial planning process. So I really like the EEF's implementation tool, or their kind of cycle.
My favourite document.
That's whatever. I might get a T-shirt with it on. It's those stages, isn't it? It's starting with the explore. So the questions are: why am I doing this? Why might this be a good lever to pull for those broader purposes? I think sometimes there's a tendency to think about coaching as being the implementation rather than the fact that you've got to plan to implement it. And it's just a lever that you can pull to deliver wider school improvement priorities. So it's starting there and being really clear, like we've discussed already, about the purpose of it, what it's going to achieve, what success would look like. It's then going into the implementation planning. And as part of that, you've got to think about the evaluation of it. And I think we might tend to think, oh, we'll just do this for 6 months, a year, 2 years, and then at some point it will have an impact. But it's important at that stage, I think, to think, well, what do we mean by impact? And if we mean pupils' results, well, we're not going to see that for 3 years, 5 years. Can we ever really link pupil results back to instructional coaching? Probably not. So then it's like, what would be some early indicators then that this is working? And then what would that look like? With and going through that EF cycle. And I think one key thing that's often missed is that the involvement of senior leaders in that. So if it's going to be sustainable, what information are they gathering from the coaching process, and what are they doing with it, and how is that feeding into other aspects of school improvement? And then equally, how is that feedback going back into the coaching process or structures and improving it? How long you work with a teacher, I think, goes back to the explore phase and what it's for. I've worked with teachers for 6 weeks where it's been like, we're just going to implement this really specific thing and I'm going to support you with it. Or a teacher said, I'm struggling with this one thing. Or I've worked with them for 2 years. It just depends. I think it's hard to ever put an end point on it, but equally you've got to say, well, if I'm just spending 2 years with one teacher, what are other teachers not getting? It depends on capacity as well. And have you got 6 coaches? Have you got 20?
Because I think what's interesting is, obviously we sit on a leaders forum for CPD, leads across trusts, don't we? And what's been interesting from those conversations has been about how many trusts are now really considering kind of career trajectory models, or like pathway models for individual colleagues across trusts. And I suppose it's for leaders to think about how this could sit as part of that wider offer, not necessarily fast tracking people to leadership, but actually fast tracking to expertise and to high levels of expertise for colleagues. And again, that's another challenge, isn't it? Is that, you know, how explicit do we make these journeys towards, and how do we know we've got to the end point? Of course, there isn't an end point, is there? Because everybody should just continually improve. So, yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so we've got a couple of schools across our trust, Sam, that some of them are obviously, well, all of them are obviously going through the ECF framework and supporting early career teachers. Many of them doing some sort of informal coaching alongside the NPQs that are on offer. Some schools are interested in implementing a coaching model across their school. What sort of advice would you give to schools or teams who are attempting to introduce a coaching model?
Oh, interesting question. So I think there's lots I've said there about the thinking that needs to happen before you rush ahead and try and do it. I suppose I would pick up on the use of the word model there. So I don't think any school should be attempting to introduce a coaching model. If they're interested in implementing instructional coaching, I think it's I mean, I'm thinking about the recent EEF report into effective professional development, and their major finding is that the form of professional development, whether that's instructional coaching, another type of coaching, whether it's CPD, teacher learning communities, whatever that is far less important than the mechanisms that sit behind it. Yeah. So rather than thinking about models, I think it's helpful to think about mechanisms. And if your mechanism, if one of the mechanisms that you think is going to be really purposeful in your school is deliberate practice, for example, and you're doing some really good whole school CPD and you want teachers to practice that, instructional coaching isn't the only form through which you can deliver that mechanism. So I've seen some schools using deliberate practice clinics, really effectively. You can do deliberate practice as part of whole school CPD in departments, etc. And I think in terms of thinking about those mechanisms, it's then, how can we kind of codify those things so that it's not reductive and we don't reduce them. I think thinking about asking the question, A, is this the right lever? Is it the right form? Does it have the mechanisms that we want? And B, are we ready for it? And are the enabling conditions in place? It's really important. We've got 4 schools in our trust. One is sort of 3 to 4 years into this. One is not ready for it. And we wouldn't attempt at the moment to try to roll that out because there's some work to do on culture for professional learning and conditions. One school, would be absolutely ready for it, but we just don't think it's the right form. It's for various reasons. There are other forms that are probably going to be more effective. So I think it's asking that question because it's, coaching happens within the context and culture and climate of a school. And it's just asking that question. Are those compatible right now? They might be in the future, they might not be right now. So I guess it's asking those really hard questions and finding the time and prioritizing that rather than seeing coaching as a silver bullet or, as you've said, like a panacea to kind of all your ills, because it won't be.
And again, that's a real challenge for leaders, isn't it? Because they're battling with so much, and there are other issues that are probably on their mind at the same time, recruitment and retention and the gas bill and everything else. It's really difficult to carve out the time for that deep thinking that we spoke about later, but so crucial in order for it to be successful overall.
And I think just in terms of a practical thing to do, because schools might be then thinking, oh, well, that what we're saying is like, unless we can find loads of time to think about it, it's not worth doing. One thing we did early on was a trial, like a small, like a pilot, and I think that was really valuable. We just had a couple of coaches, a couple of teachers, and then we learned from that before we then moved to upscale it. So I'm not saying don't do it. I've talked a lot about not rushing into it and doing the deep thinking, but we've got to marry that with practical reality, which is that lots of people are just going to do it anyway, or they want to do it. So I'd say then start small, evaluate it, learn from what you've done, and then roll it out again better. And it's that continual process of improvement and thinking.
And one of the key documents from this is going to be that EEF implementation framework, in that it's the implementation is the cycle, and as soon as you've got what you think is the end, it's started again at scale or whatever. Okay, amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Sam. We really appreciate it, and I know lots of leaders and teachers across the trust will have gained a huge amount from today's session. So we wish you all the very best with your with all of your endeavours at at the Trust. And thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Tracy. I hope you have a great rest of the day and the conference, and really nice to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.